Welcome to the Ed Show, New York tonight. 13 counts of premeditated murder. That's what the military is charging the suspected Fort Hood shooter with, Major Hassan. I don't think it's enough. I think he should be charged with terrorism. I think it was a terrorist attack. Now, I know some liberals and progressives out there are just going to cringe at that thought. But in some cases, my friends, there are absolutes. This is about motives. The United States military was attacked. They represent this country as a whole. I believe this was an attack on our country. I think we just got to look at some simple facts here. Hassan was openly questioning the mission. As a Muslim, he didn't want to fight Muslims abroad. He expected and exchanged emails with a number of radical clerics. Okay, his presentation in medical school led many to question if he was a terrorist sympathizer. He warned of adverse effects. What's that? He also opened fire on fellow soldiers at Fort Hood. Now, I don't think that's any different than the 19 hijackers who changed this country on September 11th, 2001. As an American, I feel like this was terrorism. No political party has a lock on the market when it comes to the definition of terrorism. And I'd just like to say this tonight to Dick Cheney, who's used terrorism to politicize and divide this country probably more than any political figure in the history of this country. The red flags on Major Hassan went up on your watch, Mr. Cheney, in 2007. Maybe you should have spent more time actually working on our national security instead of giving us lip service of what you were doing. The vetting process failed. A lot of people had a hand in letting this suspect slip through the cracks. Now, we have to figure out what happened here. Obviously, investigation's going on, but we can't just sit back and do it without asking the honest, tough questions and calling it what it is. In my opinion, this was not the act of one bad apple. It was an act of terrorism. I want to know what you think about this tonight, folks. Is this going too far? I don't think it is. I want to know what you think. Do you view the killings at Fort Hood as terrorism? Text A for yes, B for no to 622-639. We'll bring you the results later on in the show tonight. For more, let me bring in our guest, David Corn, Washington Bureau Chief for Mother Jones, and also Clint Van Zandt, former FBI profiler and MSNBC analyst. Mr. Corn, where do you stand on this? Was this an act of terrorism in Fort Hood a week ago tonight?
Ed, I disagree with you slightly. I think in some ways it's immaterial, that it doesn't matter. We are not fighting a war on terrorism. We're fighting a war, engaging in conflict with a certain group of people, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, other radical jihadis who plan to do harm to our country and to our
Well, that's what this guy was.
But wait a second. But to me, he was psychotic. There were indications that he was psychotic as well. He might have been acting totally on his lonesome. And to me, to talk about terrorism in an operative fashion, that means actually you're talking about an organized entity.
Now, David,
I don't care.
David, do you think the 19 hijackers had their heads screwed on right? Do you think they had some issues between the years? I mean, come on.
I think they were part of a large infrastructure that had the mission of doing us harm. Now, was Fort Hood shooter in the same position? I don't know, but at the end of the day, I don't think it matters much. If he was working with people, then we have a bigger problem.
All right.
Even bigger than the one we have.
So
but as a lone person, it doesn't matter what motivated him.
He communicated with a radical cleric. Now, we've had this big discussion about the Patriot Act, listening in on conversations, getting into people's privacy, but now all of a sudden you take the position, well, it really doesn't matter. It's not the same thing. It's very much the same thing. I mean, if he's communicating with someone who purports the idea that the United States of America should be hit, Americans should be killed, and then he goes out and does it, what the hell is that? That's terrorism.
Well, what I'm saying is, you can call it whatever you like. If he's communicating with someone, it depends whether did that motivate him? Did he act on that person's behalf? Or would he have done it without that communication to begin with? But, all that stuff to me doesn't matter. Calling this an act of terror doesn't change anything. We want our men and women on military bases to be safe from people who are psychotic, from people who are driven by religious fanaticism, or people driven by a political agenda. It doesn't matter why.
Clint Van Zandt, it just seems to me that all of a sudden as Americans we're timid. We're afraid to call it what it is. I think it's terrorism. I'm sure other people see it differently. What's the definition? Are we going to have this academic discussion in this country about what a terrorist attack is?
Well, I don't think we should. As you say, the 9/11 hijackers, they were terrorists. Timothy McVeigh was a domestic terrorist. The D.C. snipers were terrorists. When you are attacking a large group of people who have done you no wrong whatsoever, and when you're trying to instill terror into a body of people, that's a terrorist. And the challenge here was that it wasn't a case of connecting the dots. It was a lot of people had the dots, Ed, and they kept the dots in their pocket. They didn't put them out on the table.
And why did that happen?
I think the vast majority of people who took a look at this guy didn't want to call it for what it is. They didn't want to say, here's a doctor with some psychological problems. Here's a doctor who is espousing that Americans could or should die. Here's a guy who says he doesn't support America in the war. And instead of all the doctors and all the fellow medical students and the FBI and the Army CID, instead of everybody coming together and saying, let's put our dots on the table, let's see what we have, and then let's send an FBI and a CIA or a CID agent out to interview this guy, everybody passed the buck because they didn't want to call him what he was, a radicalized Islamic fundamentalist, and they were afraid to say it.
And you won't say that, Mr. Corrin? You don't believe that he was a radical Islamic terrorist?
Well, listen, I'm saying it doesn't matter what we want to call him. You can call him whatever you like. We're still... And, you earlier said, let's see what the investigation brings to bear. I want an investigation even more importantly into what Cliff was just talking about, the failure to connect the dots. We see this in a lot of institutions, whether it's the Catholic priesthood or whether it's the military. People are loath to jump on their own, and they sent him to Fort Hood without telling the people down there, the people here in the East Coast, that the guy was a problem. This is very much like the case of the Virginia Tech student who went nuts and killed people, because, again, there were a lot of indications from people who had worked with him that he was a disturbed individual, yet no one really wanted to bring to bear what that meant.
Well, look, if this guy had not been in the military, would he have been treated differently? That's one thing that I'd like to have answered. I think that military uniform gave him some cover in a sense, and I also think there might have been some political correctness in all of this. But I want to bring up the point about Timothy McVeigh. Did he fit the definition of a terrorist in your opinion?
Well, we know that his mission in life was to attack the U.S. government. Now, we know, and he was working with other people, too, and so we know a lot about what went into his thought processes that did that. At the end of the day, still, he blew up the building in Oklahoma City, the same amount of people died, and he was treated as a mass murderer and given the ultimate justice, whether you agree or disagree with sentencing.
Well, I think he was a terrorist.
But calling it, I don't see what calling it, the whole issue, fighting over whether this is terrorism or not, I think takes our eye off the ball.
I don't quite understand the difference between what this guy did at Fort Hood and what the 19 hijackers did on September 11th.
Well, Ed,
it comes from the same root of thought. It comes from the same motivation.
If it's a lone guy acting by himself, the implications of that are far different than 19 people working with a worldwide global organization that has the means to pull off a
I disagree on that.
These are completely different cases.
Clint Van Zandt, there have been terrorist attacks, suicide bombers. Suicide bombers, they act as one person, not as a group of 10. They go into a crowd, they blow up, they kill 100 people. That's the exact same thing.
Other organizations.
All right, Clint, your thoughts on this? Clint, what do you? I mean,
well, what we have to learn in this, Ed, too, is who either worked with him or who inspired him to commit these acts. I think that, if we find there's inspiration from this cleric who's hiding out in Yemen, from bin Laden or anyone else, that will further our definition. But what he will be tried as is a mass murderer. 13 individual counts of murder. He will be tried and he'll be court-martialed as a mass murderer and a killer of 13 separate people.
How do we protect against this again, Clint?
Say again, Ed?
How do we protect, you know, against this from happening again? I mean,
well, yeah, there's a lot of things, Ed. Number one, this guy bought one of his killing guns on August 1st. There was no way that gun registration. Now, what's he doing buying a pistol like that when he's about to deploy? If he needs guns, the Army will give him all the guns he needs when he gets to Afghanistan. So he didn't need a gun. So there was no way to connect gun registration with the fears of his colleagues saying this